On a freezing night in February 1959, 9 experienced hikers disappeared into one of the most isolated places in the Soviet Union. They were young, they were trained, they knew the mountains, and nothing about their expedition suggested that they would never return. But weeks later, rescuers found something impossible. Their tent was still standing. Their belongings were still inside. Their boots and warm clothing were left behind, and the tent had been cut open from the inside. Whatever happened caused 9 people to abandon their only shelter and run into the freezing darkness. None of them survived. Now, before this became one of the world's most famous mysteries, it was simply a hiking trip. 9 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute planned an expedition through the northern Ural Mountains. These were not inexperienced tourists, these were skilled hikers. They had completed difficult winter journeys before. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, and the group included 9 others. The group began their hike in January of 1959. Their goal was to cross the northern Ural Mountains and reach a remote peak called the Otorten. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures could drop far below freezing. Visibility disappeared within minutes. But this was exactly the type of challenge that this group had trained for. They documented their trip with photographs and journals. Everything appeared normal till they reached the mountain that would later carry their name. On February 1st, 1959, the group reached the eastern slope of a mountain later known as the Dyatlov Pass. Because of worsening weather conditions, they decided to establish camp on the slope instead of descending into the forest. It was a decision that would become one of the most debated choices in the entire mystery. Their final photographs show something ordinary. The hikers set up a camp, prepared food, moved through the snow. There's no obvious sign of panic, no evidence that they knew anything was about to happen. But something during that night changed everything. The group was expected to return from their expedition in early February. When they failed to arrive, a search effort began. At first, nobody knew what had happened. The hikers were experienced, they had supplies and equipment, they knew winter survival. A simple accident seemed unlikely. Then, on February 26th, searchers found their campsite. What they discovered there created a mystery that has lasted for decades. The tent was still standing. Inside were the group's belongings, their clothing, food, and equipment. Everything that they would need to survive. But the hikers themselves, they were gone. The strangest detail was the condition of the tent itself. Investigators determined that it had been cut open from the inside. The hikers appeared to have escaped through the side rather than using the entrance. Something had caused 9 experienced hikers to leave their shelter in the middle of a freezing night, and whatever it was, they left behind all of the very things that could have saved their lives. From the campsite, investigators followed a trail of footprints leading away from the tent. The track suggested that some of the members of the group moved downhill toward the nearby forest. Almost a mile away, searchers discovered the remains of 2 of the hikers beneath a large cedar tree. 3 more bodies were found between the tent and the tree. The position suggested that some members of the group may have attempted to return to the tent, but they never made it. Weirder still, the final 4 hikers were discovered months later inside a ravine. Their condition raised even more questions. Some had severe injuries, including major chest and skull damage. Some clothing appeared to have been taken off of other people and given to others, suggesting that survivors may have tried to keep each other alive. But investigators found no obvious explanation for why the group abandoned their tent. No clear attacker, no simple accident, no single piece of evidence that explained everything. The Soviet investigation eventually concluded that their deaths were caused by an unknown, compelling force. The wording was very vague. And because the investigation was closed, speculation grew. Over the years, dozens of theories appeared. Some were serious, others were far more unusual. But each theory had to explain the same strange facts. Why did they leave? Why did they cut the tent open? Why were they found separated? And what happened during those final moments? Let's look at the theories. The most widely accepted modern explanation is a type of avalanche. Supporters argue that the hikers feared a snow collapse and escaped quickly. Later research suggested that a smaller, unusual avalanche could have occurred near the tent. However, critics point out that the tent was not completely destroyed and question whether an avalanche explains all the evidence. Another explanation involves extreme mountain weather. Powerful downslope winds could have created dangerous conditions, causing confusion and forcing the group to seek shelter elsewhere. The Ural Mountains can produce several severe winter conditions with little to no warning, but again, with that theory, questions remain. And still, some theories suggested that another person or group may have been involved. Those theories often point to unusual details from the investigation. However, there is limited evidence suggesting the idea of an attack. No confirmed attacker was ever identified, nor was foul play truly suspected. And now, more than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of history's most famous mysteries. Modern investigations have provided possible explanations, but no theory has answered every question. That is why the case continues to fascinate people around the world. It's not simply that 9 people died. It's that the evidence tells a story that seems complete, even to modern investigators. The Dyatlov Pass inside the mountains of the northern Urals still hold the same silence that they did that night. 9 hikers entered the wilderness. They left behind photographs, journals, and clues, but their final moments remain hidden. And after decades of investigation, a question still remains. What made 9 experienced hikers abandon their shelter and run into the frozen darkness?